So in the last module, we focused on the law of demand, which is looking at things from the point of view of the consumer in the economy. Now we are going to turn our attention to the view of the producer, the supplier of goods and services in the economy, and in this, we focus on the law of supply in the economy. So in this module, we're going to learn things that are very similar to the law of demand, but there will be some differences. First, just like we did with demand, we are going to draw a supply curve and interpret its meaning from a supply schedule. We will look at the differences between movements along the supply curve and changes in supply itself, which are almost identical to what we meant when we talked about movements along the demand curve and changes in demand. And just like there were factors that shifted the demand curve, there are also factors that shift the supply curve. So if you understood all of these concepts from the law of demand, the law of supply should be much easier to understand because many of these concepts are applied in a similar way with the law of supply. So let's get started. Just like we had with demand, when we looked at the demand schedule, with supply, we also have a supply schedule. So a supply schedule is a table which shows how much of a good or service would be supplied at different prices. When we talk about supply, we're talking about the producers and their willingness to produce cotton in this case. So if we look at the supply schedule for cotton, we can see that there are different prices that cotton could be sold for, ranging from 50 cents to $2 in 25-cent increments. And at those various prices, we see that there are different quantities of cotton that will be produced and supplied by the growers of cotton in the market. When the price is 50 cents, they will be willing to supply 8 billion pounds of cotton, but when the price rises to $2, they will be able to supply 11.6 billion pounds of cotton. So this supply schedule shows the amount of a product that a producer is willing and able to produce and sell at each of a series of possible prices during a specified time period. The schedule shows what quantities will be offered at various prices or what price will be required to induce suppliers to supply us with various quantities to be offered. The supply schedule shows something different than the demand schedule, though. In the demand schedule, we saw that as the price was rising, the quantity demanded fell, and when the price fell, the quantity demanded rose. It works just the opposite with the law of supply. At higher prices, producers are willing to supply us with more of a product, and at lower prices, they are willing to supply us with less of a product. So, the law of supply can be stated this way, that as the price of a good rises, the quantity supplied will rise, and as the price of a good falls, the quantity supplied will fall. So, all else equal, as the price rises, quantity supplied rises. And notice we said once again, all else equal. There are other factors that will change the willingness of producers to supply us with a product, just like there were other factors that were in place that caused consumers to demand more of a good, other than a change in price. But here, the only variable that we are looking for is a change in the price of the pound of cotton. And we assume that all of those other things that can affect our supply of a good are held equal at this time. When we looked at the law of demand, we saw that there was an inverse relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded. With the law of supply, it is just the opposite. Instead of an inverse relationship, there is a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. As the price of a good rises, the quantity supplied rises, and as the price of a good falls, the quantity supplied falls. And note that when we say all else equal, just like we did with demand, that all else equal assumption refers to a handful of other factors that affect the supply of a good. These will be called the supply curve shifters because just like with demand, they will shift the entire supply curve to the right or to the left. And these will be covered shortly. So now, let's plot the prices that we see in the supply schedule. When we do that, we see the law of supply in action. If we plot each of these prices from the supply schedule on the previous slide, and then we connect the dots, we come up with a curve that we label capital S, which stands for supply. And we call this the supply curve. But notice that the supply curve is upward sloping. The demand curve was downward sloping from left to right, but as we move from left to right on the horizontal axis here, we see that the curve is upward sloping, reflected that direct relationship between the price of a good and the supply of a good. Now, notice, just like with the demand curve, we always label the price of a good on the y-axis, and in this case we label it price of cotton per pound, and we always label the quantity on the x-axis, and in this case is quantity of cotton measured in billions of pounds. So, that becomes important to know. So the supply curve shows us graphically how much of a good or service people are willing to sell at any given price. The supply curve also illustrates the positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. The upward slope indicates lower quantity, as measured on the horizontal axis, at a lower price as measured on the vertical axis, and it shows a higher quantity supplied at a higher price. So, if the price of cotton rises from $1 to $1.50, the quantity of cotton supplied rises from about 10 billion pounds of cotton to slightly more than 11 billion pounds of cotton. This is what we call movement along the supply curve. Just like we had movement along the demand curve, we can also have movement along the supply curve. Each point along the supply curve represents a specific quantity demanded at a specific price. And so, as the price changes, we move from one point to another point along the supply curve, and that is called a change in quantity supplied, just as when there was a change in price, we called it a change in quantity demanded. And we call this movement along the supply curve. So, the law of supply says that other things being equal, the price and quantity supplied of a good are positively related. We've stated that. But we said there are other things that can cause an increase or decrease in supply other than a change in the price of a good. And these are what we refer to as the supply curve shifters. These are the other things besides price that we talked about which can affect the supply of a good. So changes in a supply curve shifter cause a change in supply, meaning that the entire supply curve moves to the right or to the left along the horizontal axis, causing the supply of the good to increase or decrease at every possible price. So if the supply curve has increased, it has shifted to the right, meaning at any price, firms wish to produce more. If the supply has decreased, the supply curve has shifted to the left, meaning at any price, firms wish to produce less. So what are these supply curve shifters? What are these things that can cause the supply curve to shift to the right or to the left? Well, one is a change in technology. A technological improvement means more efficient production. A change in technology allows us to produce more goods and services from the same scarce resources. And we call that more efficient production. And therefore, if we're getting more out of the same amount of resources, we're doing so at a lower cost. Anything that lowers the cost of production from the producer's standpoint will incentivize the producer to produce more of a good. Anything that increases the cost of producing a good for a producer will incentivize the producer to produce less of the good. So think of each of these supply curve shifters as affecting the cost of production, the cost of producing a good or service. And if it costs the producer more to produce a good, they will produce less of it, causing supply to decrease. And if it lowers the cost of production for a good to be produced, it will cause a producer to supply more of something, thus increasing the supply. And so this is what technology does. Because it produces more goods efficiently, and it leads to more efficient production, it lowers the cost of production. So a change in technology will lead to an increase in the supply, or a rightward shift in the supply curve. So if there was the adoption of improved cotton growing technology, that would generate an increase in supply, meaning a rise in the quantity supplied at any given price, as reflected in these two supply schedules on this table. You can see that before the new technology, at every single price, a lower amount was supplied than after the new technology was adopted. Once that new technology was adopted, you can see that at every single price, suppliers are willing to produce more cotton than they were before. So this event is represented by the two supply schedules and their corresponding supply curves. This leads to an increase in supply and a shift of the supply curve to the left, or to the right rather, to the right. And you see that on this graph right here. Now remember, we always measure a change in supply along the horizontal or x-axis. So to represent an increase in supply, we shift the entire supply curve to the right, as represented by supply curve 2 in this table, and the adoption of new technology in the supply schedule. A shift of the supply curve is a change in the quantity supplied of a good at any given price. And instead of calling this a change in quantity supplied, we call it a change in supply, because the entire supply curve is moving to the right or to the left. And again, let me emphasize that economic language. When you use the term change in quantity demanded or change in quantity supplied, you are referring to movement along the supply or demand curve from one point to another as a result of a change in the price of a good. If you are shifting the entire demand curve or the supply curve to the right or to the left along the horizontal axis, you are shifting and increasing or decreasing supply at every possible price, and this is called a shift of the supply curve rather than movement along the supply curve, and we refer to this as a change in supply rather than a change in quantity supplied. So make sure you use the terminology correctly, because they refer to two different things. When you're talking about quantity demanded or quantity supplied and their changes, they are only caused by a change in price. A change in supply or a change in demand refers to the entire demand or supply curve moving to the right or to the left, and that is caused by one of the supply curve shifters or one of the demand curve shifters. So let's look at this. When we move from point A to point B, you'll notice that the quantity of cotton supplied changes. It increases from 10 billion pounds of cotton to 11.2 billion pounds of cotton. So there's an increase in quantity supplied. But notice it's going from A to B is movement along the same supply curve. When we move from point A to point C, we also increase the quantity supplied from 10 to 12 billion pounds, so that also leads to an increase. But notice, it's not movement along the curve, it's caused by a shift in the curve, and it is not caused by a change in the price of the good, because the price of the good remains at $1. When we move from A to B, the price is rising from $1 to $1.50. So a change in price causes a change in quantity supplied and movement along the supply curve, but any other thing changing means that at every single price, the supply will increase. So a movement along the supply curve is different and is not the same thing as a shift of the supply curve. Once again, we represent an increase in supply by shifting the supply curve to the right, and that is represented by supply curve 2, and that is how we label it. A decrease in supply is represented by a shift of the supply curve to the left, and that is represented by supply curve 3 in this graph. So an increase in supply means a rightward shift of the supply curve at any given price, meaning there is an increase in the quantity supplied. A decrease in supply means a leftward shift of the supply curve, and at any given price, there is a decrease in the quantity supplied. So, what are the supply curve shifters? Number one, a change in the price of any input will increase the cost of producing the good, or decrease the cost of producing a good if those prices go down. So what do we mean by inputs? Remember what inputs are. Inputs are the factors of production: land, raw materials, labor, hiring workers, capital goods. Okay? Producers, when they produce goods and services, produce them from inputs, the factors of production: land, labor, and capital. So they have to buy all of those things. If the cost of land, labor, and capital rises, that is a change in the input price, and then it makes it more expensive for them to produce that good or service. So the cost of it is going up. If there is a rise in an input price, it will cause a decrease in supply or leftward shift in the supply curve. Likewise, a decrease in an input price will cause an increase in supply or rightward shift of the supply curve. So if there is an increase in the price of fertilizer, it would cause a decrease in the supply of corn. There can also be a change in the price of related goods or services. Remember, goods can be related to each other either as substitutes for each other or as complements of each other. So here, sometimes goods are substitutes in production, meaning, let's say you're a farmer and you have an acre of land. You can produce corn on that land, or you could substitute corn production for wheat production. So wheat would be a substitute in production for corn. Okay. Complements in production are things that go together and are produced at the same time, such as when oil is produced, we may produce jet fuel and gasoline as refined from that oil at the same time. So if the price of a substitute in production for a good rises, producers might shift production towards the higher priced good, causing a decrease in the supply of the original good. So an example of a change in technology might be looking at whether or not genetically improved seeds will increase the supply of corn. Because when we develop new technology to produce different kinds of genetically modified seeds, that could lead to an increase in the supply of corn because you can produce more corn per acre. So technology is the method that people use to turn inputs into useful goods and services. So anytime we improve the methods that we use to turn inputs into useful goods and services, we lower the cost of producing that good, and that induces suppliers to supply more of something. The next thing that can cause the supply curve to shift is a change in future expectations. Remember, just like we, with demand, had future expectations about product availability, incomes, prices, and things like that, suppliers have expectations about the future as well. And suppliers particularly look to changes in their expectations about the price at which they can sell a particular good or service. So, if a supplier thinks the price of a good is going to rise in the future, they will supply less of it now because they'll hold it back, wanting to supply it in the future. But if they think the price of a good is going to fall in the future, they will supply more of it now because they want to sell it now before the price goes down. So, expectations about the future price of a product can cause producers to increase or decrease current supply. For example, expectations of higher corn prices next month may cause farmers to decrease the supply to the market today. And finally, just like we had changes in population and a change in the number of buyers with demand, on the supply side, we can have a change in the number of producers or sellers. If more sellers of a good enter the market, more producers of a good enter the market, then the supply of a good will increase. And if producers leave the market and there are fewer producers left in the market, then the supply of a good will fall. So all of these lead to shifts of the supply curve. And just like we had individual demand curves and a market demand curve, we have individual supply curves leading to the market supply curve. So each producer in the market has their own individual supply curves, represented here by panels A and B, Mr. Silva and Mr. Liu. And each one of them has a different willingness and ability to supply corn, or to supply cotton rather, and that amount of cotton at different prices. But to determine the amount of cotton that will be supplied in the market as a whole, you simply sum all of the individual supply curves of all of the individual producers in the market, and the sum total of all of that gives us the market supply curve. So the market supply curve is the horizontal sum of the individual supply curves of all firms in that market. And just like I gave you a chart in the previous module on all of the factors that can shift the demand curve, these are the supply curve shifters. All of the factors that can cause the supply curve to shift to the right or to the left. So this is a good chart to copy down, have in your notes, study it, and memorize. Because that's one thing that you really have to do. You need to memorize all of the demand curve shifters. You need to memorize all of the supply curve shifters. You need to understand how the demand curve shifters and the supply shifters work, and when and under what conditions they shift the supply or demand curve to the right or to the left. Realizing that the only thing that can cause movement along either the demand or the supply curve is a change in the price of the good. All other factors lead to shifts of the supply or the demand curves. This is an FYI that you can read through, and you'll be doing an activity later on in Launchpad that references this for your information slide. So I'm not going to talk a lot about this right now, but you may wish to pause and study that because it gives you an example of how supply works in the actual market. So now we come to the end of Module 6, and we'll summarize what we've learned in this module. In Module 6, we focused on the law of supply, and we saw that the supply schedule shows the quantity supplied at each price and is represented graphically by a supply curve, and that the supply curve usually slopes upward. We saw that when we move from one point to another point along the supply curve, that is called a movement along the supply curve, and it only occurs when there is a change in the price of a good. A change in the quantity supplied at any given price represents a shift of the supply curve to the right or to the left. And just like there were demand curve shifters, there are 5 main factors that shift the supply curve for a good or service. One is a change in input prices. Second is a change in the prices of related goods and services. Third is a change in technology. Fourth, a change in expectations about the future price of that good, and a change in the number of producers in the market. All of these can affect the cost of a good or service, and anything that leads to the cost of production going down will increase the supply of a good, and anything that leads to the cost of production rising will lead to a decrease in the supply of a good. And we also saw that the market supply curve for a good or service is the horizontal sum of the individual supply curves of all producers in the market. This brings an end to our study and look at Module 6, the law of supply.